I am not a serial killer by Dan Wells. This is quite the interesting read for me, not only because obviously Dan Wells is being folded into the cosmos as an author, but in addition to that, he's someone who has made quite a name for himself for writing these John Cleaver books. And I'm happy to say that I have read both I Am Not a Serial Killer and watched the 2016 film, which I'll be talking about just a little bit at the end here. But I do feel the need for this book to dive in fairly deep, so there will be a spoiler-free section and then a full-on spoiler conversation at the end as well. But before we get into that, this video is brought to you by my own personal Kickstarter, which is well over 45 times funded and officially coming to a conclusion on Wednesday. So if you would like to go ahead and back the project and get one of those thickum, very affordable, similarly priced to what you could get on Amazon bookmarks that feature art from Felix Ortiz and are for my Lawful Time series, go ahead and check out the link in the description down below. Wraithmark Creative has pretty much put out maybe the best piece of merch I've ever had with these, and I'm really excited with how well they've been done. But yes, they're officially going away in this Kickstarter. So if you'd like to go ahead and back it, go ahead and check the link down below. But for now, let's talk about the fact that I'm not a serial killer. I promise. I Am Not a Serial Killer follows the fabulous tale of John Wayne Cleaver, who works in a funeral home with his single mother. Now, John is a diagnosed sociopath, and a large amount of the first half of the book is focusing on just his struggles with this diagnosis, his therapy, and the war going on in his mind between trying to be a functioning member of society and this lack of empathy and compulsion to kill that he's building walls to try and prevent from taking control within himself. And all of this internal struggle is developing while it's revealed that a serial killer has actually become active in the town John Wayne Cleaver exists in. And so he starts to obsess and look into the case. And this admiration he begins feeling to this new serial killer that is active around him is obviously very bad for the internal struggling happening within this high schooler. And these roiling convulsions within John start pushing him towards some darker tendencies around his classmates and things like that he's been long fighting to keep under control. And so the stakes begin to build rapidly. And what became very apparent right away as I started I Am Not a Serial Killer is that Dan Wells is a kind of author I really enjoy the writing style of. He doesn't have the most purple prose, but he has a very good control of what I've called here on the channel of blue-collar prose. Very Stephen Kingian, even in the type of story he's telling as well. We even have like the bully characters you'll see in Stephen King. It's very much so in that vibe, but not ever feeling so similar that it detracted from the experience at all. It's just close enough for me to safely go, yeah, if you like Stephen King, you'll probably like Dan Wells' I'm Not a Serial Killer. And in terms of his writing overall, being able to capture this character at the heart of the story, John Wayne Cleaver, was exceptionally impressive. Yes, there is the big highlight narrative, center spotlight, the fact that he is a diagnosed sociopath, and all the internal struggles that brings within John Wayne Cleaver. But there is still a dedication from Dan Wells to make him feel like a realistic teenager living in America as well. So there's almost like this two sides to the character that both feel well realized, and they come together to establish John Wayne Cleaver as a protagonist that you almost fear while sympathizing for. Like constantly throughout I Am Not a Serial Killer, especially in the first half, I am thinking like, oh, I feel bad that he's really struggling. He's struggling with that. You shouldn't struggle with that. I feel bad. Don't stab people. I'm sure the comparison's been made a million times before and it'll be made a million times again, but that, I believe, is what made the early seasons of Dexter work really well for audiences, whether it's realistic or not. Having a human part of a sociopath protagonist gives an audience something to latch onto, whether it's them wanting to just try and be normal and behave sincerely, and so you can kind of latch onto even like a faux part of their humanity, or it's something where they're afraid of what's inside them and they're almost like fighting it. All of it is well-rounded and apparent within this protagonist who, despite behaving in some ways where he's clearly not a good guy, you end up being very comfortable with him driving the story. And we'll talk about this a bit more in a spoiler section at the end, where we're also going to be talking about the movie a little bit. One of the reasons that I was hesitant until the very end of this book to really believe I'd like it as much as I do is when it comes to having a dangerous protagonist, someone who is not a traditional good guy. A lot of authors just don't have the follow through I feel they need. They'll back down, have some kind of cutesy moment where it's like, I guess he wasn't that bad. No. Dan Wells, at least for this first book, absolutely maintains that his protagonist is a sociopath and will act and think in ways very comfortably that you will then have to look back on and go, oh, no. And that's what's kind of really addicting here. All of that praise being said though, at about, I believe, though the structure of the movie's telling of the story could be messing with my memory here, between the first third and the halfway point, there is a supernatural twist to the story, and it really pulled me out of everything that was happening. I don't believe it's a spoiler for me saying that, because why else do you think it would be here on this channel? Hi, I'm the sci-fi fantasy guy. But with everything being built up to that point, being such a grounded view of this character and the struggle going on internally with him, having something that was so outlandish be introduced definitely made me have to rethink how I was approaching this story as a reader. Thankfully, that character follow-through was strong enough, and Dan Wells' writing and immersion into this character's mind was nuanced enough that I was won back over by that end. And I think I would like the reading experience as a result better upon reread, because I wouldn't have that pull out, and because I'd have faith in the execution of the narrative, I'd be able to immerse myself more smoothly all the way through. But ending the completely spoiler-free section, I Am Not a Serial Killer will get a solid 7.5 out of 10 for me. But let's go ahead and talk a bit about spoilers here, because this one has been out for a long time, and I have thoughts. But okay, spoilers, 3, 2, 1, go! Let's talk about the fact that that active serial killer in this little old small American town turns out to be a demon. Mr. Crowley. That reveal was simultaneously where I got the most pulled out of the narrative, where I was like, whoa, I did not actually see that coming, because I went into this with no expectations for this book. I wasn't even sure I was going to review it here, because I didn't know there was this fantastical twist. But once that came out, I went, oh yeah, all right, this is going on the Sci-Fi Fantasy channel. And Mr. Crowley must consume other people's body parts to replenish his rapidly rotting corpse of demonic possession? And John Wayne Cleaver sees him murder multiple people, and this is maybe one of my favorite areas of characterization for Dan Wells, that at one point, John kind of calls for help because he's like, I don't really care this person's dying, but it's the right thing to do to call the police. And then he gets 2 cops murdered, and that's all the justification he needs as a sociopath to be like, okay, I'm not going to try to get any help from the outside again, and I'm going to try and handle this myself. Which, getting into the psychology of John Wayne Cleaver and what he's been built up to be until that point, that makes absolute sense, because if you really read carefully this book, John is very selfish, and he has a self-centered worldview, so it makes sense that a sociopath would be like, okay, it's mine to deal with then. And I actually would have continued to believe the narrative if he just never called the cops at any point. But I like that he did, because it kind of answered that question of like, well, why wouldn't he? And from there, John Wayne Cleaver begins obsessively following and stalking this demon, to the point where I actually was like, this is creepier than what the demon's doing, kinda. And earlier I talked about that really rapid building of stakes, and seeing it come to fruition with him going on this hunt. It began to feel like the most dangerous game to me, but like for the sociopath who wants to go after the demonic level problem. But then all of this comes to a crescendo after John has done his research and been able to realize he was stalking Brooke and having to correct course to just fully focus on his actual enemy here. And he does one of the most insane things I have ever seen a protagonist do, but again, it absolutely makes sense with the way John thinks and operates, because Dan Wells took meticulous care to again and again, almost how Robert Jordan explains his magic systems, explain John Cleaver's thought processes. And so he figures out the weakness to this demon is that it actually has a human attachment, something it cares about and loves, and its wife. And so he breaks into the demon's home while he knows it's out hunting, desperate for a new part that if it doesn't get soon, it will die, goes to its wife sleeping in bed, and beats her brutally with an alarm clock again and again, loving it, and then takes a bunch of photos and sends them to the demon like, hey, you might want to come back from your hunt, cause right there. And the fact that this teenager is going through and outplaying a demon by going to a length of evil that's causing an innocent bystander to get beaten in their bed
It's a little disturbingly poetic about humanity, is it not?
Which is like, after playing all these psychological games with the demon, such an escalation from an already insane place to be. Dan Wells, congratulations for writing a protagonist beating an old woman in the face with a clock and making me be like, this makes sense right now. Oh my god. I actually stopped reading at that point. It explained to Kayla what was happening in I Am Not a Serial Killer, and I had to finish it all with like, but it makes sense for this character, which Kayla was like, does it? And of course, John has had this therapist who's been attempting to helping him. After he beats the demon's wife, he's horrified by how like gleeful he felt, and he ends up calling his therapist and saying like, I've done it. I've gone too far. I've maybe killed this person. I'm a monster. This is horrible. Then he's like, thanks for talking to me, and just like hangs up because he gets back in control, and he's like, I gotta get out of here. There's a demon on the way. And then as he's booking it, the demon arrives home. By the time he recovers, demon runs into the home as John gets outside. I love the way the fear within John is portrayed in this moment, because very often like people are like, oh, sociopaths feel no fear. That's not how being a sociopath works. They have survival instincts. And John discovers that the demon has killed his therapist, who went out looking for John after the phone call. And the timeline there is a little bit wonky, but I'm able to suspend my disbelief enough. And, you know, okay, he happened to find him. All right, I'll buy into it. It's the biggest reach, though, in a story with two serial killers, one of which happens to be a demon. I also see how both times John calling out for help in this book, resulting in innocent people being caught in the crossfire and dying, setting up the sequels for him very much so being an isolated hunter. Whether or not he's just killing people or trying to find more demons, I don't know. But absolutely, it's a good setup for the series that I'm not too sure how much legs it has going forward. I am curious enough to read the sequel, but I like that that can easily be interpreted as John's going to be an isolated individual from here on out because he literally got people killed. And then he hides the body so that the demon can't feed on it, because the demon didn't have time to after seeing the photos of its wife with a bashed in face. There's this big confrontation where John's mom gets involved. They have to like flee, and they eventually end up killing it back within their funeral home. And it all worked pretty well, and especially the relationship build up between John and his mom became very like crystal clear to the reader of how his mom has gotten to a point where she pretty much has to accept that John's side of the story exists because she saw the demon. And despite all these concerns about her son being a high-functioning sociopath, or is that high? I don't know if he's high-functioning. I need to do more research before I say stuff like that. She's able to say like, well, he did something good here, so I can accept that he's in control, and they move on because you know, a parent wants to see the best in their offspring. But then adding like the salt seasoning on top of this story, there's this end scene where John wants to like learn the story of the life of the man he killed, or the demon he killed, and so he goes and he sits down and he starts talking to the wife who survived his face bashing. And she starts telling him, because she doesn't know he's the one who did it, he kept himself hidden the whole time, of like the life of the man she married. And I had a moment where I was like, that's sweet that he wanted to just learn, but he bashed this woman's face in and she doesn't know, and he's sitting with her. Oh my God. And that's like the trick of I Am Not a Serial Killer. It fools you into being like, good move, John. Not good move, John. You leave her alone. But this was a super fun game of cat and mouse. Narratively, I really like the character of John Wayne Cleaver, and I think Dan Wells' writing carried this story. He, as a writer, is someone I am very happy to hear is going to be getting involved with the Cosmere, and I will be seeking out more works from him in the future, because it's just a good time. Goes to its wife sleeping in bed and just beats her brutally with an alarm clock again and again. Time. Loving it. This brings me to talking about the 2016 movie. And I'm not going to just trash this movie. I actually think there are some really admirable attempts at recreating characterization from the book and certain sequences from the book. The best of the ability of the clearly limited budget this production had. The highlights, though, and pieces that deserve praise are both the performance of the lead actor, who looked crazy familiar to me, and I will look him up and have his IMDb here now so you can all realize where I knew him from. It's here. And Christopher freaking Lloyd as the demon, and he did a really good job as well. I mean, it's Christopher Lloyd, him being this creepy, looming figure and looking so sick, but also so intimidating, was really impressive from a performance standpoint. And hats off to the mother actor actor who I know from Breaking Bad, who I might like her performance in this as much as I did in Breaking Bad. There's just from there a lot of things that clearly were made to be done because they didn't have the budget to make this a direct adaptation, and some restructuring of the story that I feel like was designed just to give Christopher Lloyd more lines that really ended up hurting the overall narrative. So that big climax I just spent a bunch of time talking about in detail that leads really smoothly into a final confrontation in the movie is entirely broken up, and there's a funeral that happens in the middle of it, which destroys the structure of the book. The pacing and structure of this story are murdered in the movie, unfortunately, and that is largely due to some impressively shoddy editing at times. I actually think the direction was pretty good. There's some really interesting shots and stuff that makes you absolutely connect with this character. Not as much as the writing did, but like you get some understanding. But the biggest ask for the character of John Cleaver is to make him feel like a freshman in high school, which he is in the book, and kind of be a kid, but also be dangerous. And that is something that Dan Wells did masterfully. Like, he really feels like he's 14, 15, but also kind of dangerous. But here it feels more like an 18-year-old adult who's still definitely a teenager, but doesn't have that almost like still developing childhood angle to them. That's just kind of lost in the remediuming of this story. Again, though, credit to the actor. For the lines they were given, he did a really good job. There is also a couple choices in how the demon is portrayed at the end where they show it fully with their very limited VFX budget, and it's not acceptable for 2016. It's not acceptable for low budget 2016. It just looks bad. And then finally, there is some combining of scenes to try and efficiently deliver a lot of the key points of dialogue from this story that don't work because those scenes shouldn't have been put together. The most egregious of which I think is one of the kills, which is kind of really rushed along, one that they make happen in a barbershop for the movie. It's really clever how it's covered up in the book and how it's played out. I actually think it's a lot more atmosphere, and the location is scarier in the book. And instead they put it in this store in the movie. I imagine to make the blocking a bit easier and save money on having the demon kind of be off screen, not seeing too much. But I feel like it would have been a smarter idea to do that in the dark and have some kind of interesting thing there. I just didn't like the choices made. But then also with the character of the mother at the beginning, she confronts John in a way that's kind of public about something that is extraordinarily private. And I do not remember that happening in the book. And it made me like the movie watching experience of how the mother character is being portrayed, being like, oh, you don't really respect your son's privacy because you're mentioning this in front of basically strangers, which the mother in the book did not give me that impression, though she does have a maybe slightly unprofessional relationship with this therapist in the book. But again, they like play that up in the movie in a way where it goes from being like believable to what's happening here. If you love the book, I would still watch the movie just out of like a curiosity of what a decent B-movie adaptation of a book like this could be, because again, with their budget, I think they did a perfectly acceptable job. The book, though, really liked it, and I consider myself now a fan of Dan Wells. And I stick by my very solid 7.5. But this has just been my review of I Am Not a Serial Killer. I promise. Like and subscribe if you have not already, and check out the Kickstarter if you'd like to get your hands on a super gilded, luxury, reasonably priced bookmark. Have a good one, y'all. Bye!
And of course, I'd like to record a special shout out to Romeo Mike. What a distinctive name.